Appreciate that. All right, and
Time.
yeah, go ahead.
Hi, it's me again, Stefan. I broke up earlier.
Yes, anti-whiteism.
Yes. So I'm glad I can get a chance to speak to you. I'm not sure what happened to the connection back there, but apologies for that. But
It
yeah,
may not be
so
your fault, but go on.
well, I think it was because I connected it to the Wi-Fi, which is a bit less reliable in Australia because our government built the system. So
Well, and I mean, of
so
course, you're upside down, so it's
yes, no, it's actually you that's upside down, Stefan.
yeah, fair.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
uh, in Canada. Um, so basically, this whole anti-whiteism thing is just sort of take consumed me with trying to sort of overturn it because I've got 5 kids myself, and I don't want them to be brought up into a world where they're disadvantaged because of just being born white. And it appears as though, like, if I don't succeed in like my mission, so to speak, to overturn anti-whiteism and turn anti-white discrimination into an immorality instead of a morality, of which it is categorized today, then they will suffer disadvantage when they're applying for jobs, um, and um, and just they'll sort of be faced with anti-whiteism, like rhetoric and in the media and things like that, um, like with regards to white erasure of like television commercials, for example. I'm sure everybody can relate to that. They've seen that there's always got to be a non-white person in the ad, and the sort of false morality of anti-whiteism has sort of created this idea that it's the moral thing to do to remove the white people from.
Well, sorry, just to be clear, to have a non-white person in an ad is not white erasure. It's when you have a situation where historically it would be white people and there are no white people, or something like that. Like in history, if you're kind of going back that kind of way. So having a person who's non-white in a commercial, I just want to be clear. I don't think that's the issue. I think it's when there aren't any white people in a traditionally white situation that seems a little sinister, right?
Yeah, so true, so true. Like in Australia, we have a company called Amy, and at the end of the ad, this lady comes on, and it's always "Lucky you're with Amy." You might have seen it, but there's probably an example in Canada, and they've sort of switched it out with like an Indian person or an African person, and white people, when they see that, they're used to seeing white people in that role, and they liked that fact that the person was white in that role because it reflected them and who they are and who our country is. And when they see a non-white person that sort of filled that role, it's not to say the non-white person's inferior or anything like that, not at all. But it causes a spiritual injury, a psychological injury
Hmm.
to white people when they see that, because they feel like everything's slipping away. They feel like things are being stolen from them. And they also feel like if they speak up against it, they will be deemed immoral by society and they'll lose their jobs and things like that. So, um, yeah, I just thought I'd sort of touch base with you and just see what your thoughts are on the issue. And
Yeah, I
yeah,
think there was a commercial for education in England. I don't think there was a single white child in the commercial. That just does not seem right or fair, and certainly demographically, it's non-representational. So, yeah, I mean, I've been talking about it for years. I think it is an issue in that, in general, conflicts between white people and non-white people, the white person's always considered to be at fault. And I don't even like watching murder mysteries anymore, because if there's a non-white person in the murder mystery, they can't be the murderer. So it just no, because you just know that that's not going to be. So it actually just takes sort of the fun out of it, as far as sort of puzzling things out goes. And the sort of colorblind society that was put forward many years ago does not really appear to be bearing fruit, in that crises of racism and white supremacy and so on are just continuing to escalate in many areas, and I think it's a real shame. Now, as far as being able to sort of push back against this kind of stuff, I think just point out that anti-white racism is morally indistinguishable from anti-black racism or anti-Indian racism or anything like that. And I think you just have to be pretty firm with people. I mean, obviously not violent or mean or anything like that, but no, that is racist. If you're going to talk about, oh, whites with slavery, it's like, no, that's racist. Whites ended slavery, and whites were one of the least slave-owning societies in the history of the world, and the transatlantic slave trade was like what 1/20th of the slave trade to the Middle East and so on. So you just have to push back against these kinds of narratives. And of course, as people saw when I gave my speeches in Australia, I sort of cast about long and hard for what I was going to talk about. Ended up talking about the sort of violence and some of the real evils of the Aboriginal community. And people lost their collective shit about that sort of stuff. And it's like, well, these are just facts.
Yeah.
And I had meticulously sourced data from like mainstream anthropologists about the Aboriginal community. And I think that is, that's pretty terrible stuff. Like I said on Twitter the other day, I have all these land acknowledgements, and we even heard them in Australia and so on, these land acknowledgements. And certainly in North America, the indigenous population, they practice slavery. So if you're going to have land acknowledgements for slave owners, then don't you have to have land acknowledgements because of the Civil War in America, and have land acknowledgements for the plantations? Because I thought the principle is we will have land acknowledgements for slave owners, and the whites, a small percentage of whites in the South were slave owners, but a significant proportion of the indigenous population in North America were slave owners and traders. And so if we're going to do land acknowledgements, regardless of the morality, then that's not a principle that can be sustained. I don't want land acknowledgements for any slave owners at all, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And, you even have, there was some woman, I can't remember, I'm going to probably butcher this to some degree, but she was talking about, the Aztec sacrifices. She was an anthropologist, I think. Oh, the Aztec sacrifices, they weren't that bad because, the kids were volunteering and they were drugged and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, it's madness. It's absolute moral madness that now we're trying to soften like bloody-hearted, stone through the chest child sacrifice by saying, well, they were largely voluntary and they were drugged, so it wasn't so bad. And we're like at some point, we're going to have to get our head out of the ostrich sand and start judging things according to objective moral standards. White societies, and also mistaking whites for what their governments did. And I wouldn't do that to any culture or civilization, right? So, I get into this occasionally on X, where people will say, oh, colonialism, this and that. It's like, colonialism sucked for the average white person, especially the white male. I mean, we were conscripted and taxed and sent out on these long voyages with no vitamin C. We got scurvy, lost our teeth, and died. Like, it was horrible. And so saying, well, whites had all this colonialism, like, no, that's governments. That's different from the people. The people are not the government. And in fact, I mean, particularly prior to any kind of elections, the government did not represent the people at all. And even since elections, it's pretty hard to find any correlation between what the people want and what governments actually do. So, collective negative judgments about race is racism. And we just have to keep pushing back against this, rather creepy escalation of aggressive rhetoric against whites. I mean, I kind of get it in a way. White culture, for whatever reason, tends to be pretty small government, particularly males. We tend to be pretty free speech. We tend to be pretty free market and so on. And so for all the, monopolistic control freaks out there, white males are a bit of a thorn in their side. And so I think that there's a certain amount of just negative rhetoric. And it is something that we just have to push back. Now, as far as kids go, and I've talked to, of course, a lot of people about these kinds of issues from just about every race, is that, as the economy gets more and more political and more politicized, I mean, I think that the only solution really is to try and teach your kids everything there is to know about being an entrepreneur. And this is kind of what happened to the whites in South Africa, that because they faced so many quotas and couldn't get hired, they ended up being entrepreneurial. So, these kinds of challenges, our ancestors survived brutal winters and Genghis Khan and war and the Romans and all kinds of stuff, the feasts, famines, the Black Death, courtesy of China, not for the last time. And so, we'll make it. But I think, we have to push back against racism in all of its forms. And we certainly have to push back against thinking that we can just go and get jobs the way the boomers did. I mean, I remember when I was looking for work after I had a pretty impeccable resume, selling, building software, building companies, selling to Fortune 500 companies, traveling the world, doing presentations at conferences, and running a whole technical team of 35 people. I had a pretty impeccable resume. It was really hard to get any kind of work because I'm clearly as white as the driven snow, and therefore I became an entrepreneur and or continued down my path of entrepreneurship. And so I think that's one of the things that needs to be taught anytime that your kids, and this is true, of course, for the people, let's say that you're a black parent and for some reason you feel like your kids aren't going to get hired for whatever reason, then you got to work on entrepreneurship. And the same thing is true for white parents. There are, people talk about systemic discrimination. It's like, but the only stuff that's written into law is don't hire as many white males. That's me. If you want to look at your systemic discrimination, it's kind of it, right?
Yeah.
It's literally there in black and white, and yet people don't want to talk about it. So, yeah,
Mm.
if you catch people, saying these negative things, you can whites be criticized? Absolutely, for sure. Yeah, and can other races be criticized? Yeah, absolutely. If it's a one-sided thing, though, and if it's using standards that apply equally, if not more, to other races, I mean, one of the bloodiest things in human history was the Saracen takeover of India, and boy, that was pretty colonial in pretty horrendous ways, and that's never really talked about or called out. So I think that's really the best that we can do, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned your speech in Sydney, how you focused on the horrors of the Aboriginal communities and their culture. This culture that we're told is 60,000 years old, and then you sort of went into it. I think at the time they said 30,000, so you were probably saying it was
I think I
30,000.
clocked in at 40, but maybe it's gone to 60 since.
Yeah,
Although I
they had
guarantee
about.
you it didn't really change from 40 to 60.
No, but they say it does. Now they say 80,000, and I say tomorrow they're going to say 100,000, and then they'll say when the Big Bang happened, that's when the Aboriginal.
Older than the known universe. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, maybe even before then they'll just keep going. But when you when you did speak about that, that was fantastic, and that was really like mind opening and just transformative in Australia. It was just fantastic. But what I've discovered since that time, which it sort of expands upon what you were saying in that speech, which is that but instead of focusing on the flaws of non-white races, we need to focus and focusing on the flaws of the white race as well, which you sort of touched upon there. Some of our failures and some of our most shameful moments.
Pathological empathy, the white man's burden, going around trying to civilize the whole world and turn it into London. I mean, or at least as it used to be. Yeah,
Yeah,
these were all desperately bad ideas and wrong choices and immoral things. But sorry, go ahead.
yeah. So what we're sort of trying to do, and if you look at my account, and I'm desperately trying to get more followers. So if other people can in the chat or whatever want to follow me, that'd be fantastic.
You should mention your account for those who are listening.
Yep, it's called Anti-Vilification League on X, which is AVL_social. And you'll see there that I just work tirelessly to try to overturn this very immoral social morality. But what we do is we don't focus on the negatives of non-white races. We focus on the achievements of white people and of white Western civilization. For example, in schools in Australia, if that's the example I can give, they teach children about Aboriginal culture, but obviously they leave out the horrific parts that you spoke about. Um, but they never actually mentioned that, the internal combustion engine was invented by Scottish people and the steam engine. And they go through the magnificent white inventors of history. And so we want to build a community. We want to build a people out of a deracinated race. So we want all white people all around the world to realize that we are one family. We're all very closely related. We all produce the same things. We all naturally produce Western civilization, or as you referred to, we naturally create London, like just through us being who we are and doing what we want to do. Um,
Well, and just to back you up with the data, which again I've talked about for years, white people around the world tend to commit crimes at about
yeah,
the very
all that.
same rate.
Mm,
And it's obviously more than East Asians, who are pretty much the least crime people. I mean, at least ever since the sort of kamikaze days. But yeah, so it is fairly common wherever whites go. And of course, you can see this with the examples of South Africa and other places, that where the whites go, you tend to end up with that same kind of culture and civilization, which is true for most races and most cultures and most ethnicities.
Mm.
And so, yeah, so there is some evidence statistically for that kind of stuff.
Mm. Yeah. So basically, what you're talking about there, we refer to as a biospiritual tendency, or the biospirit of a people. And Africans have their biospirit, where I'm sure you could understand how, like, if you leave your bike there, then somebody can just take it, and it was the person who left it unlocked. That's their fault that they left the bike
Well,
unlocked.
again, we wouldn't want to put them all into sort of one giant category, but I
Mm,
think in general, sort of as you zoom out more,
mm,
you can see certain tendencies. And my position, again, as you know, has always been you never judge any particular individual. But if you zoom out enough, the data tends to take over, and you can make um, fairly broad-based judgments about things. But again, you would never, like Tom Sowell would never take your bike. I'm pretty sure of that, right? So, but yeah, I think that if you're going to have a multicultural society, but then you say to one group, you can't have any happiness in your history or your culture or anything like that, that's not the deal. Like that's not the deal. Like I would never say to somebody who was mestizo or somebody who was South Asian, or you can't have any pride, and it's like you can't have any happiness in your history and so on. And there have been sort of very specific experiments in the West. I mean, in the UK, in England in particular, about 1% of the most violent and criminal population was like executed or thrown in prison to the point where they couldn't reproduce, like every single year. And over
mm,
centuries, on average, I mean, there's a reason why the British are so polite, because people
mm,
who weren't polite ended up on the chopping block or hung in these sort of public spectacles that I wrote about in my novel Just Poor.
mm.
So um, there are particular social policy, legal decisions that, say, the British people made in the past that end up with quite a different society than other cultures that don't have that same sort of whittling process.
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, I think it's deeper than that. I don't think it was necessarily sort of eugenics, which is what you were referring to there, where you'd lock people up if they had, genetic tendencies for theft and things like that.
Well, but it wouldn't be eugenics. Sorry, just to be clear, it wouldn't be eugenics as a program because they didn't understand genes back then. It was
Mm,
just an impatience or an anger or a frustration with the criminal element to the point where you just, and I'm sure a lot of innocent people got scooped up in the mix, but you just took the violent people and put them in prison or executed them or shipped them to your neck of the woods.
yeah.
It wouldn't be a eugenics program in any way that we would understand it in the modern world, because of course they didn't understand genetics back in the day.
Mm, mm. Can I ask you a question about Canada? Would you, like, when you look back at Canada before, like, the mass immigration, would you say that, uh, like, how do we get back to that spot, or have you given up on getting back to that, or um, like, how would we get back to having England, like London, like Tommy Robinson said today, make London look like London should look? And what he was referring to there is, like, that London and Londoners and English and Great Britain, people, Great British, they um, are actually a race of people. So, and that's an awkward fact. Like, how do you get from
Well, okay,
here?
sorry. I mean, I think I understand the question. So, again, I'm off politics, and I would not want a political solution to that which involved any increase in the use of state force or state power. I think, at least for me, whatever the problem is, the solution is more freedom. And what I mean by that is, let's say that I think that affirmative action and race-based hiring policies and quotas and gender-based hiring policies and quotas are immoral. People should have freedom of association. They should be able to hire who they want, fire who they want, and so on.
Mm,
And so I think those should go, and I think that would help a lot reduce tensions. Sort of my concern is that, in the past, you had all of these religions after the crack of Christendom and the sort of spread of the Protestant Reformation. You had all these religions trying to gain control of the power of the state because the state had the power to enforce and inflict religion on people. I suppose my concern is that particular cultures, if the government gets heavily involved in promoting or demoting particular cultures, that every culture is now going to try and get a hold of the power of the state to impose its will on others. And I don't want any culture or ethnicity or race to reign supreme or anything like that. So, to me, the answer would be something like, well, I think that race-based quotas and preferences in hiring are immoral. They violate freedom of association. And I also think that things like the welfare state and so on, well, I've always been against the welfare state as something that both corrupts and is immoral. And so I think that if you end up with a smaller government that has less power or ideally no power to prefer one group over another, or to have this sort of sweet honeypot of free goodies available to people who make it to the shore, I think that things then work out. But yeah, every solution that I have involves less government power and more voluntary and free association, because then you actually have a community that's chosen each other, rather than communities that are there perhaps as the result of state power or influenced by state power, which is not exactly organic. So yeah, whatever the problem is, my solution is less initiation of force, more peace, more reason, more freedom, more voluntarism, more free association.
Yeah. Well, I suppose you could say that the people, if you say you're Indian living in Canada, you actually do have freedom of association, because if the policy is to exclude white males, then if you had no intention to hire white males in the beginning, then that's no problem for you. You're like, okay, fine, no white males. And then you just hire some Indians, which is what you want to do because you have freedom of association. But this lack of freedom of association only applies to white people, because you have to, like when you're a corporation, you have to have a certain quota, and everybody's trying to morally posture and
Well,
advertise
and there
that.
doesn't, sorry to interrupt, but if you look at sort of the gender stuff,
Mm.
then when does the promotion of equality for women become female superiority, right? So when you look at universities and they're like 65, 60%, even higher of women, at what point do we say, well, men are now underrepresented? And the problem is, I think people's concerns is that people aren't looking for balance. They're looking for the pendulum to swing too far, and there's not a corrective mechanism. And I haven't, of course, noticed women's groups saying, well, we kind of, I think we've overdone the female stuff with regards to education, because now the boys are getting harmed, or I think we've over feminized education to the point where the boys, when they're younger, are being harmed or excluded, and we know for sure that there is prejudice against male marks in school, because when you take the gender identifying marks, you take the gender identifying information off tests, then the boys get much better marks. So we know that there's prejudice against boys in school. And, it's one of the problems with the sort of balancing stuff that the government does. So the government says, well, we want to up this and we want to, maybe balance this out. The problem is that when does it stop? When is it enough, right? The problem is, of course, now you have all of these groups. They get their funding through the promotion of this inequality stuff between boys and girls, or males and females, and the gender gap and pay gap and all that kind of stuff. And there aren't enough women in STEM and so on. And the problem is, when is that problem solved to the point where all the systemic barriers have been removed, and then it's up to people's choice? But when the government funds these kinds of activist organizations, there's no incentive for them to say, we're done, because no organization is going to disband its own payroll and say the job is done. Now, in the free market, when you have an injustice and people say, well, there is this injustice, here's how it's mapped, and we're going to work to resolve it. When the injustice is largely resolved, people stop funding it, and then they go and find other things to do. But with sort of perpetual government funding, these equality metrics never end, go too far, and then I think you just end up with a problem on the other side, and there's no place where the pendulum comes to rest in the middle. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention at the end? I've had a good old long show, and I did a lot of work today, so I think I'm going to pack it in. But if there's anything else you wanted to mention at the end, I'd certainly be happy to hear.
Sure. Yeah, just summarizing, I'll be very respectful. So, yeah, basically, racist is an anti-white slur. It's not actually a concept which actually has a definition per se. The left, the anti-white...
Sorry, just to be clear, it's an anti-white slur to the degree which it is never...
only applied to...
it only applies to potential white negative opinions, right? If it never applies to any other racist opinions or anti-whiteism, then yes, I would agree with that for sure. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so it doesn't it doesn't actually apply to non-whites. For like, and you mentioned the gender issue before, where you said what boys are disadvantaged. Only white boys, because if you're a black boy in a school, we know for a fact that the teachers will, like in many places in the United States, they're actually passing people through high school if they're non-white who are not, because they say it's like systemic racism or whatever. But that is just that word that they put in racism is just a word that disarms white people and allows them to, like, white people will then allow themselves to be discriminated against, and they'll allow that. It's like an altar of sacrifice almost, like they're allowing their boys to be disadvantaged purely based upon their race, and then non-white people, it doesn't apply to them.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's the basic gist of what we do. We're just trying
So
to,
maybe it's racism and sexism all combined in one tasty
well,
smorgasbord.
well, it's not sexism. It's specifically about the race of the
No, but
boys.
that's why it means racism and sexism. So white boys.
Well, but sexism is a subset. It's a toolbox of anti-whiteism because it
Right.
only applies to white communities. Like, that's why the feminists don't go after the Muslims, because Islam is a racial movement. It's almost 100% non-whites, particularly Arabs, and they, yeah, it
Huh,
doesn't
maybe not
apply
for
to them.
long. Go on.
Yeah, well, if we're successful, then we'll overturn this whole thing. But basically, like, the feminists don't go after the Muslims, even though they obviously should, because it's a non-white, like,
You mean
group.
like in terms of criticizing and so on, right?
Well, obviously, putting stamping it out, like, really,
I'm
like,
not sure what you mean by stamping it out.
well, by saying that it's immoral what they're doing, basically. So,
Well, yeah, if they're concerned about, say, more rights for women and so on, having these sorts of criticisms, I just, yeah, want to make sure that we're talking about sort of peaceful debate here. But anyway, sorry, go
yeah,
on.
yeah, yeah. So the everybody, which includes you, which includes me, and everybody listening, should, if they're really applying philosophy to the world, they should be actively opposing anti-whiteism, because it is the problem that is behind all of the other problems. Everybody has a major problem with the mass immigration. I'm sure most people here would agree with me. So we need to build a people out of a deracinated race. And how we do that is we become white positive. We focus on the achievements of our people, and we realize that before this mass immigration, like, Canada was a race of people. Like, it was a people from Europe. They were all white people. It was the same with the United States, the same with Australia. So when we look at these flags, when we look at when we talk about the culture of Canada and of Australia, we're actually talking about our Western culture that we naturally produce out of ourselves just by doing what we want to do. Then that
Well,
creates
and of course, if
like that.
people have an issue with what you're saying, and I'm sure some people would, you just have to know if you're being racist or not. You just have to take white out and then say, do Japanese people have a particular culture that wherever they go, they tend to reproduce? I mean, I think that's pretty true. And I know, so for instance, Germans in the 19th century were a pretty strong contingent in Russia, and they stayed in their own communities and they spoke German, and then they left often after the or during the 1917 revolution and went back to Germany, and they were sort of accepted back because they'd kind of stayed the same way. And so yeah, if people have an issue with culture and ethnicity being somewhat combined, but they only have it with white people, then that would be an indication, I think, of the kind of racism that we're trying to oppose, right?
Well, I mean, racism, like I said, like, respectfully, I'll disagree that the racism is just an anti-white slur to get the anti-white outcomes that the anti-whites want. It's not actually that they care about racism, and like as we define it. So when we look at what they say, when they say, "Oh, you're a racist," what we think is that, oh, that's someone being discriminating against some other person that based upon their race, based upon their birth. But the true definition is anti-whiteism. The true definition is it only applies, like, that to white people. It doesn't apply to anybody else. So we can't use that term racist, because it, like, that's why it's never worked. Like, we've said it the whole time. We've been saying, oh, like, no, they're the real racist ones because they're discriminating and all this and that, and they're obsessed with race. And we're not. We want a colorblind meritocracy and things like that. But how has that worked out for us? It hasn't worked out well at all because this whole time it's just been a ruse. This whole time it's just been slurs against white people who want to maintain their culture and thereby maintaining their very existence. Like when you look at London, for 100% fact when you look at many places in Canada, many places in Australia, the non-whites are so collectivized and so hostile, and they hate the English, and it will result in the displacement, the complete displacement, and we call that biological white erasure, where an area has no white people left. And when you look at what happened in Luton with Tommy Robinson, etc., and every province all around the UK, the rape jihad that took place was specifically targeting not people based upon being British or based upon being Christian. It was based upon their being white, and the Muslims, the Pakistani Muslims, as has been exposed, were ethnically tight with their Pakistani brothers and sisters, and they want to move out the white people through torture, basically.
Well, to be fair, they also did target some of the Sikh girls as well.
Well, I mean, but maybe they did, but by far, like 98% would have been the white
I
people.
don't know the numbers, but I'll go with what you say. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, this is a fight for survival, like that we're facing right now. The right sort of look at what's happening and say, "Oh, we must maintain our culture," and like JD Vance may say, "Oh, we need to maintain American culture." But in order to defeat anti-whiteism, we need to actually explain what culture is. We actually have to fully assimilate into our consciousness that who we are as a people is the thing we produce, and that is what culture is. It is a biospiritual instinct, and they are using this word racist, they're using this word Nazi, they're using these words, these concepts, these sounds that they form with their mouth that put white people into a trance, and then they just accept what they've said and then try to rebut and say, I'm not racist, and then they come up with a whole bunch of reasons why they're not racist. But instead, the winning formula, the way that we win, is we go free of the anti-white narrative. And how we do that is we form our own concepts. And the main concept there is anti-white. So if you say, you can say whatever you like. You can say, I want Australia to be just made up of my people, like it used to be. That was great back then. And somebody says, you're racist. You say, why are you so anti-white? Why do you defend the Zulu tribe when they're being invaded in Africa, but when the English people are being invaded, like literally invaded on
No,
land,
no, no, no.
why
But
don't you
this,
defend
no,
them?
no. Hang on, hang on, hang on. No. So I listen. I understand your frustration. I don't agree with everything that you're saying, and I don't want to get into sort of specific details because again, it's been a long show. But no, it's not an invasion. It is not an invasion. It's not military. It is not anything like that. And the challenge is that when you make the fundamental sin of allowing the government to redistribute massive amounts of resources, then you become a target for people who want to come and get stuff for free, whether it's domestic and people are just moving within England, and this happened with white people as well, or it's international or whatever. It is not an invasion. What's happened is, in my humble opinion, that fundamental sins were made in the 20th century where British people, long before anyone else came in, all the white British people said, we are going to allow the government to gain control of trillions of dollars of resources and hand it out as the government sees fit. That did not come from Muslims, that did not come from Sikhs, that did not come from Africans, that did not come from anywhere else, but from within the British culture itself, the tidy-whitey British culture itself, all decided, and this happened all throughout the West, and you can say, well, it was to do with women voting and more security over freedom and all that kind of stuff. But it is not, and I'm gonna push back on this hard, and I'm not going to even make this a debate because I'm it's getting kind of late and all of that. But I will say that if you want to know what happened, people sinned, and the wages of sin is what, right? The wages of sin is bad things that happen. And so when the white, British, Western, whoever, right, all decided, well, we're going to have the government take over everything. We're going to have the government take over charity. We're going to have the government take over healthcare. We're going to have the government take over education and roads and everything, the post office, everything. The government's going to run everything. It's going to be handing out. The government's going to take over the currency. It's going to get rid of the gold standard. The government's going to have the power to draft people at will. We made this massive Leviathan totalitarian, semi-totalitarian state with the power to redistribute all the resources known to man, and then we're surprised when it goes badly in whatever way, right? And the idea we're going to, I'm not saying that you're saying this, but the idea that we're going to run to more government and more government is the wrong approach. It's the wrong approach, and I don't like that people say, well, it's all the fault of everyone else. That is not true. And now we can say it's the fault of the boomers or the last generation or this, that, or the other, but it is not an invasion. To me, even if we look at the worst case scenario, it is the result of the white people, and this happens all over the world, but we had it way better with smaller government in the past. It's white people deciding that the government was going to solve all of our social problems, giving all this power to the government, and then being absolutely shocked when that power ends up turning bad or ends up turning wrong. But that's what happens with power. What happened? This is why you don't do these things. This is why you don't give the government this kind of power, because it is going to go badly. Whatever power you give the government is going to be used against you in some way or another. And so I'm going to sort of end the show here. But I get, let's work against the racism, and let's work. I agree with all of that. But the idea that it's just some victimized thing from outside, an invasion, I just couldn't disagree more strongly. This is what happens when you give the government all this power, and a wide number of bad things have occurred out of this. Maybe the immigration stuff is one of them, but the problem is power. The problem is not any individual ethnicity or any individual race or anything like that, and it certainly is not something that I would want people to come out of this show thinking that the poor whites and it's all being imposed. It's like no. These are decisions that were made by white people, by our ancestors, by men and women through their vote. And I say this because, of course, I have spent a lot of time, when I was younger and I lived in a mostly white countries. I spent a lot of time telling white people, not because I was targeting white people, it's just that it was mostly white people. I spent a lot of time talking to people about the need for freedom, the need for voluntarism, the evils of the welfare state, the evils of giving government so much power. And white people, men, women, young, old, all told me I was wrong and bad and crazy and immoral and it was nuts and how dare I and all of this kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, well, then if you believe that all of this kind of power can accrue to a small number of people at the very top and everything's going to work out well, it's not going to. And I told everyone it wasn't going to. So I'm sorry, I'm just a little bit older than you. So having fought for freedom since I was in my mid-teens and I'm now in my late 50s, so we're talking a good ass number of years, the result of letting governments take over everything is always bad throughout history. It manifests in different kinds of ways. But this is why I say, whatever the solution is, it is less power, less coercion, less violence, and nothing else. All right, thanks, everyone. I appreciate your conversations tonight. freedomain.com/donate to help out the show. I really would appreciate that. Have yourselves a glorious evening. It will be a Sunday donor show. You can go to fdrurl.com/locals to join us for that. And have yourself a lovely night. We'll talk soon.